What's up, everyone? Pags here at MEI Studio. This week, we're going to take a look at what comes after the mic, but before the converter, and what impact it has on our sound, if any. Looking at preamp coloration this week on the Mic Locker. We've now looked at dozens of mics that have produced dozens of different sounds, which were intended for many different applications. This time around, I want to take some time to look at the next piece of equipment in the chain, the mic pre. The mic pre's lineage can be traced, as most audio devices, to the telecommunications industry. The first widespread use of microphone technology was found in telephones in the late 1800s. Back then, when a signal needed to be sent long distances, and I'm not talking like cross country here, like one town over, there were substations where a signal would be patched that had what was called a relay. This was a device that picked up the incoming signal by way of a signal recorder and then retransmitted the sound to the destination or the next relay station, depending on how far it was going. It wasn't until 1912 when the first amplifiers became available, thanks to Lee DeForest's invention of the vacuum tube. The vacuum tube gave birth to the radio transmitter and receiver. By 1919, radio in its infancy was gaining popularity around the world. Within the next few years, radio stations began springing up all over the country and all over the world. By 1928, basic amplifiers were becoming commonplace for all sorts of applications, from telecommunications to cinema and public address. The idea of increasing the output of a microphone before hitting an amplifier came about. One of the first to do so was a company in Europe called Siemens and AEG, which you might remember from our Neumann video. Under their moniker Telefunken, they developed the V1 preamp, which later evolved into the V41 and went through numerous revisions, eventually resulting in the V71 and V72, and then the legendary V76. Models went all the way up to V78, but those were, let's just say, not as popular as the 76s. Other companies were getting in on the game, like RCA in 1932 with the RCA 41A preamp and the RCA Photophone PA82. By 1936 or 37, depending on your source, some folks from Western Electric saw the company's cinema equipment division faltering, and Altec Lansing was formed. Buying up what was left of Western Electric's cinema equipment business, Altec quickly gained a foothold in the cinema industry, making speakers and amplifiers. Eventually, Altec got into the studio market, making everything from microphones to preamps to speakers and more. Following the Second World War, Universal Audio developed the 610 preamp. Over in the UK, the BBC was breaking new ground in audio tech with just about everything. Ampex was releasing tape machines and all sorts of high-end audio gear. Fairchild started releasing audio gear, including the 662 preamp in the 1960s. Then, the advent of the transistor changed everything, giving rise to modern classics like Neve, API, and eventually Focusrite, SSL, Trident, Dayking, and so many more. The whole time, cost for producing these things was falling, and the quality was getting better and better. If this sounds familiar, we're in a very similar time now with loads of really cheap equipment that is light years ahead of what anyone from the 50s and 60s could have even imagined. So all of these different pre's had different circuit paths and components, and thus had slightly different sounds. The reality of transparent audio wasn't quite a thing until digital audio came out, and most gear was designed to be used to make up for some shortcoming of some other piece of gear in the signal path. High-gain preamps were needed to blast a signal onto tape that was significantly higher than the noise floor of both the tape and the machine itself. Some pre's, through the use of certain components, mainly tubes, transformers, combined to create a certain sound that may have had a unique frequency response. Transistors helped push the envelope a bit further as they got better and quieter. They required a lot less voltage and drew less current, making running the machines cooler and were cheaper as well. These signature voicings are what we consider the mic pre's color. It's a sonic signature that lends itself to the signal coming from the mic before it gets to tape or whatever the recording medium is being used. In addition to what can be considered an EQ curve, some preamps introduce distortion. Now, we're not talking about what we think of as like guitar distortion, although if you drive some of these pre's hard enough, you certainly can get something like that. But the distortion here adds some kind of harmonic content to the signal, which can come from the tubes or transistors or even resistors and capacitors and other components, which can all impart noise and other artifacts onto the signal. With that said, let's take a look at a whole bunch of different preamps that we have here in the studio and see what kind of sound different pre's can add to the signal, if any. I'm going to preface this with a conversation that I've had more than a few times with a few different engineers. Most recently, my friend Mikhail up at Black Rock Sound in Connecticut had the talk that the preamp that we choose doesn't make a huge difference in the broad scope of things. Sure, they all have little quirks and can behave differently depending on how you use it, but in the context of a mix, not so much. As soon as you start applying EQ to that signal, you're changing the sound of the instrument mic pre combination anyway. So, does it really matter? Let's find out. We're going to start from the newest and work our way back in time, kinda. Let's start with the 4th generation of Focusrite's Scarlett interface and preamp. The mic pre in this basic interface is IC based, meaning that the transistors and other components for the amplifier in here are all on a chip. And there's nothing wrong with that. SSL built an empire on this type of thing. If I'm not mistaken, the preamp chip in this device is the same as found in the SSL2 interface, which is around the same price point as the Focusrite 2i2. The SSL2 features a switchable 4K control, which is supposed to emulate an SSL 4K console pre. Having played with that interface, I found that it just adds some gain, treble, and thus noise to the signal, which is adding some character, so I'm not going to knock it. The Focusrite here has the air switch, which engages the air and drive functions of this unit, which, again, some tonal options that we definitely would consider coloration, as it's changing the characteristics of the signal coming in. So, what are we looking at? In terms of the base unit with nothing engaged, we have a very run-of-the-mill, straight, very clean preamp. While some may look at that as having no character, these types of ultra-clean preamps certainly have their place, as we'll see in a bit. We have an input impedance of 3K, which from our impedance video, we know is a nice middle ground sweet spot for most mics. Dynamics, condensers, and many ribbons will sound decent through this preamp and allow the mic's characteristics to shine through. And honestly, there it is. Using a very clean pre will give you a better idea of what the mic by itself sounds like. These types of pre's also allow for emulation processing to be more accurate as well, like what we find in the universal audio devices. Default setting is just a straight pipe through, pretty much no coloration on the pre's part, but then we get to this air button here. When clicked once, we engage the air setting, which is a ridiculous high shelf EQ applied to the signal before hitting the converter. Now, for a condenser mic or a bright dynamic mic like a Bear Dynamic 201 or a Sennheiser 441, this is probably going to be overkill. However, for a darker mic like some cheaper ribbon mics, this can really help a mic come out and sound pretty decent. We're going to hear this in action during the listening portion of the video. If you don't want to hear me yammer on about the tech stuff anymore, you can skip to the listening portion. Timestamps are in the description. I don't blame you at all. This setting can also help with vocal or spoken word by bringing out more of the breathiness if that's something that you're going for. This can also be done in post, but if this is the sound that you're looking for, I always shoot to get the sound that you're going for at the mic. It's less that you have to deal with later. If we hit the button again, we engage this drive mode. This is another extreme EQ setting that has more of that broadcaster smile EQ with the mid scooped and the bass and treble sides boosted. This is also supposedly adding a little bit of distortion to the signal, which is a desirable trait for more high-end preamps. There's a catch to this though. The drive only starts to really show itself when you get to a saturation point of the pre, which is around -10 dBFS if you're looking at it in a dual meter. That means in order to really get the benefit of that drive function, you're going to need to record kind of hot with the drive function engaged, as this behavior doesn't seem to show when you have the preset flat. Either way, I think it would behoove Focusrite to maybe separate that drive to its own control and have the EQ voicings be separate as well. Give the end user better options. Anyway, next up we have another inexpensive interface, this time by Universal Audio with their Volt line. Again, we have a chip-based preamp, but this uses a different chip, so maybe it'll sound different? Probably not. Again, the aim of the basic pre-interface combo is to give a decent, clean path from the mic to the converter. Like the Focusrite, the Volt has a switch for a vintage function, so again, we have some color control at the preamp level. This switch is supposed to try and emulate a UA610 preamp, which we're going to check out as well later on. In addition, there is a 2 dB high shelf EQ that starts around 1K, a slight, barely noticeable dip in 500 Hz, and a little bit of bump in the low end when engaged. So similar to what the Focusrite drive function was trying to do, just a little more subtle. This interface also has a 3K input impedance, but there's another thing I've found. When you start to drive the pre up in that less than negative 10 dBFS range while the vintage mode is engaged, those harmonics start to show. Interesting, and for both the Scarlet and the Volt to work like this, it'd be a lot cooler if that extra saturation could happen at a lower level. Just my 2 cents. For our third pre, I wanted to look at something that's supposed to be ultra clean, but not in the prosumer level market. This is the Avid Pre. This is an 8-channel preamp, DI, and line level device. I say device since it's not an interface and needs to be hooked up to an interface like one of our Avid IOs or 192s. The Pre is another IC-based preamp with full digitally controllable functions. From the front panel or through the software, which is built into Pro Tools, the preamp can have its gain, phantom power, pad, polarity, high-pass filter, and input impedance changed. We can see that the response of this Pre is pin straight, and even when driven, doesn't really exhibit any nonlinear or harmonic additions to the response. This Pre is akin to what you'd see on something like the UA Apollo as far as the functionality and response goes, and that's a good thing for things like the Sphere mic, which needs calibrated pairs of preamps to use properly. The Pre can change impedance for its mic input from 1.5K to 15K to 1.5 meg, which can really help dynamic and ribbon mics shine. If only it had a little bit more gain than the 69 dB that it has. Nice. Next up, we're going to go to a preamp that has a ridiculous amount of gain, along with a very low noise floor and a very high input impedance. The AEA RPQ. Ours are the 500 series in the studio. This is a JFET-based preamp that boasts an amazing 80 dB of clean gain, along with an input impedance of over 10K. This Pre features 2 separate gain stage controls, a stepped gain control that can provide up to 55 dB or so, and then a continuous control that, when maxed, adds another 25 dB, bringing you to that 80 dB total. Again, we see a very linear response when operating at safe levels. Let's look at the harmonic content now, and we see a normal spike. But what we can do with this Pre is crank up the first gain stage and lower the second's level, allowing us to drive the Pre into saturation. This is some color that can be taken advantage of when you want your recording to get a little bit of grit to it. Just got to be careful not to overload your converters. Next up, we have another Pre that features input and output controls and is a little off the beaten path. This Pre is made by a company called Hairball. If you haven't seen or heard of them, you're not alone. They're famous for their 1176 kits, but started making their own preamp designs a number of years ago. One of those preamps is called the Lola, after the company's owner's late dog. Even has a little Lola on the front panel. This preamp is a hybrid of ideas, borrowed from the likes of John Hardy and Millennia. It has input and output transformers based on Neve equipment, something we haven't run into yet, transformers. Those transformers are based on the Neve 1073, and the gain stage, however, is somewhat unique in that it uses 2 opamps in series. If you're not familiar with what an opamp is, it's an operational amplifier, which is usually a small circuit that is either put onto a chip form or made from discrete parts and is a plug-in type device, kind of like these. These are famously found in API, preamps, consoles, compressors, etc. The Lolas we have here use the 990 style op amps from Hairball, although I have tried others and it does offer up slight tonal variations. I do like the sound of the 990, which is a recreation of an op amp design by Dean Jensen that was developed in the late 70s to early 80s. The mic Pre has an input impedance of 1.6K. Not great, but again, at safe levels, we see a pretty flat response with an ever so slight roll off in the top end. That is, until you start to drive the input. Then the frequency response changes with the addition of those added harmonics. And it gets harmonically rich when pushed. So a best of both worlds here, where you can be conservative with the gain and get a nice clean sound, or drive it and dirty things up. Yay, color. Next, we have another off the beaten path preamp, and I wanted to include this since its amp is something different from all of the rest of them. This is an MA1 Germanium preamp. Designed in Italy, these preamps were my go-to for the longest time for bass and is still kind of my go-to for certain types of music. The previous pre's all used silicon transistors in one form or another. This pre uses a germanium transistor that's made out of germanium. Germanium is just a naturally forming element that's a semiconductor, and it's similar to silicon, but where silicon tends to be kind of clean and open, germanium tends to exhibit more of a bandwidth limited response and has a little natural grit to it. These pre's feature API-like input and output transformers. We can see that we're no longer in flatline town when it comes to the frequency response though, and this is an example of coloration from frequency response. The bass starts to roll off around 40 hertz or so, but has a little dip around 70 and then kind of flattens out. But really, it's just a gentle slope upwards till you get to 5K. Then it starts to curve up a couple dB to 20K. When we look at the harmonics on this preamp, we can see that our harmonic friends here are present and are a little quirky at any volume level. So you really can't dial away the harmonics or flatten this out at all, and it is what it is. And if you like the sound that this offers, great. If you don't, there's not much you can do about it at the preamp side. You'd have to fix it in post, which is why it's important to understand what a preamp sounds like before you commit to buying it. Next, we're going to take a look at another preamp that uses both transformers and a discrete op amp. This is the API 312. A venerable classic of American music production that has placed its signature sound on countless records. The best I can describe it is like the sound of the 70s and early 80s in America. The company API started in 1969 and used to be not too far from our studio here in a town called Huntington. Then they moved around a bit and now are located in Maryland. But we have a custom-built 8-channel 312 unit here that is literally one of a kind. It features selectable input transformer taps on the front and 8 active FET DIs on the back with selectable input impedances for those as well. These pre's are another input-output transformer setup and feature the famous 2520 op amps. These op amps were known to be open and punchy with just a touch of air in the highs. The input impedance is around 1400 ohms or so, which isn't the best when it comes to ribbons, but it can work. These pre's will exhibit a little bit of harmonics when pushed, but remain pretty clean. And since I don't have an output control on this pre, something I probably should have added, I can't really drive them too hard without clipping the converter, but either way, these pre's sound amazing on drums and guitars. Next up, we're going to look at what many people consider to be the holy grail of preamps, and yeah, they're nice. The Neve 1073. Originally designed by Rupert Neve to be a clean BBC quality preamp and EQ that fit into the A88, the 8014, and 8028 console. These hit the market right around the same time as the API 312 did in 1970. Where the sound of the 312 was considered American, the sound of the Neve was undoubtedly British. We have a pair of 1073s here, which, just so everyone knows, the 1073 is actually just the EQ. It's not the preamp. The preamp part is the 1290, the EQ is the 1073. Anyway, We have a custom-built 8-channel 1290 unit that I lovingly refer to as the Beast because it's heavy as hell. The Pre's feature a 3-stage gain layout powered by transistors, no discrete op amps here. The preamp has a selectable impedance of either 1200 ohms or 300 ohms, neither of which are great for ribbons, but the 1200 ohms setting will still make the Royer 121 sing. While our 1073s don't have a full output control, our 1290s do, which allow us to drive the input hard before it hits the converter, if we want a little bit of crunch, and you can get some crunch out of this. The linear response shows the famous bump in the low end, and for what it's worth, we're only talking about a dB or so rolled down from 15 hertz to about 30 hertz. So those emulators that hype the hell out of the bottom end, it's not really what a Neve sounds like, although it sounds exciting when you use it. Anyway, in the upper end of the spectrum, we see that the Neve rolls off a bit as opposed to rolling up like the API did. Again, a slight touch of tonal color, but really extreme ends of the spectrum. The Pre's do exhibit some added harmonics at any gain level, but are nothing crazy. It gets really fun when you start to drive the front end. I mean, you can get full-blown distortion pedal sound out of this thing if you hit it hard enough. Next up, we're looking at yet another type of preamp, a tube preamp. The 610 from Universal Audio. Ours is an LA610, which has the LA2A style tube compressor built into it, which can be taken in and out of the signal chain. And I say this is a style because it's not actually a full LA2A circuit. It's kind of part of one, but not really. Anyway, the gain reduction is done using what's called a T4 cell, which is an optical device. Another discussion for another time. They also make a 610 by itself, the 610 Solo, or a 6176, which features an 1176 style compressor. All right, I got to focus here. The left side, though, is the preamp, the 610, which is what the Volt was trying to emulate. The preamp is often sometimes blamed for being noisy, and I honestly have never experienced that. But this preamp does have some tricks up its sleeve that those that have never read the manual may not know about. The input gain, which is not the big knob here, but the 5-position switch on the top left, is a negative feedback loop for the -10, -5, and 0 setting. This helps to lower the incoming signal by running a reverse polarity signal back to the input to reduce the gain. This has the added side effect of lowering the distortion and allowing for a more clean signal, if that's what you want. If you want to get dirty with it, though, you're going to have to use the +5 or +10 setting, where the harmonics will begin to rise and the tone can go from a nice slightly saturated or colored sound to some gritty distortion depending on the level of the incoming signal. The Pre features a switchable input impedance of 500 ohms and 2 kilo ohms. There's a little bump at the bottom just under 30 hertz and then a very slight dip in the vocal range and a little sweep up at 6K and above. Our thicker line here tells us that there's a little bit more going on distortion-wise on the top end. But that's not a bad thing. Again, we're looking for things that are not a flat line. That's color. This Pre is pretty flat, though, as far as the response goes. Not sure where UA got this crazy hyped curve for the vintage button on the Volt, but it's nothing like that. At very low levels, with the gain set at -10, there are a few harmonics to speak of, but as we get into the usable gain range of the Pre, we start to see these nice extended harmonics starting to poke out and add a little bit more to the sound. Lastly, we have another oddball. This is something that you can't really buy. It's rarely comes up on the used market, but I consider it to be the most colored Pre in my rack. This is the Joemeek VC1. It's similar to the LA610 in that it has a preamp and an optical compressor built into it. It is transistor based though and has an input transformer only, no output transformer. In addition, the Pre has an enhance function which is kind of like an exciter and allows you to dial in the amount of the effect that you want. In moderation, it kind of acts like the air function on the Focusrite, but just wait till you see what this thing does. It's wild. The fun part of this Pre is depending on where you set the gain, the frequency response changes quite a bit. The harder you drive it, the more extreme the effect on the response. And since this unit does have an output adjustment, you can drive the heck out of the front end without worrying about clipping the converters. Harmonically, this preamp exhibits harmonics at just about any gain setting, even more so if you start hitting the front end harder. On the enhance function, well, there are three controls: the drive, the Q, and the enhance knob. The drive and Q do nothing without the enhance set at something other than 0. If we give a little bit of enhance and then drive things, it'll start to get a little weird and quick. The manual makes mention that it's something that takes practice to kind of get to sound good, and having played with this thing for years, it's absolutely true. And looking at it on the meter, it's even more mind-blowing. I could see that this thing can go from a tame kitty to, oh my god, it's tearing my flesh off in an instant. It's a really interesting preamp and unique in its functions. Now that we've gotten the technical stuff out of the way, let's use our ears now and see if we can actually hear these differences that we see on the scope. I'm not going to be able to drive each of the preamps, but where I'm able to, I'll try to give an example of it. Since we have 10 preamps that we're looking at, I'm going to try and keep the examples kind of short. Otherwise, this video is going to wind up turning into another marathon kick drum mic type video thing. Nobody wants that. To test this out, I wanted to try and cover the entire frequency spectrum with examples for two reasons. One, testing something that's rather bandwidth limited, like a voice, a guitar, or bass, doesn't really give the full picture of a pre on its own. I've split the demo into 4 sections: overdriven guitar, bass, voice, and a synth. The reason I picked the synth is that it's one of the only sustaining broad spectrum instruments that you can record. While drums certainly cover a wide range, its transient nature doesn't really bring out the tonality in a way that we can easily hear or see for that matter, since the kick sits in the low end, the snare and the toms are in the middle, and the cymbals are up top. Since the synth is active across the entire frequency spectrum, all at the same time, it just makes it a lot easier to hear and see on the scope while we're trying to take a look at these things. So let's get to it. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. This is the Rode NT1 first gen from the late 1990s. The preamp and settings are listed on screen. This is a mic pretest. Well, that was fun. I haven't sat down and experimented with the pre's in a long time, and it's good to get a refresher on what these things can all do. What preamps do you use? Are you using anything that you find particularly colorful that gets you a unique sound? Tell us about it in the comments. Did any of the pre's that we tried out today stand out to you? If so, which ones? Let's chat about it. While I have my favorites for certain tasks, any of the pre's in the studio can be really used for anything that we need to record. If not driven into saturation, most of these pre's here are pretty flat with some small bumps here and there. The differences between the pre's and the bandwidth limited situations, to me at least, it's not really a deciding factor on which pre I'll use for a given task. The differences in most bandwidth limited situations just really isn't that big of a difference to make me care about it, to be honest with you. There's another aspect of preamps that we didn't get into since I'm not quite sure that it counts as being considered coloration, but perhaps it is. Each preamp tends to handle transients in its own way. The IC pre's tend to be pretty quick and true. The Germanium is as well, but it doesn't recover from a clip or a loud sound very fast. Kind of has this weird compression thing that happens. The RPQ, on the other hand, immediately bounces back from loud transients, which is why we use these pre's for our drum overheads. The tube pre is amazing on vocals and instruments that don't tend to have really overly complex transients. While it sounds great putting a kick mic through it, the drum room mic tends to get a little bit more blurry than that of like the Neve, the API, the Lola, or the RPQ. But sometimes that's the sound you're going for, which is why we have all these great options. Sometimes the simplest answer is the way to go for most things. The preamps in the inexpensive interfaces are good enough to handle just about any situation you throw at it. And honestly, without the little added features, these pre's aren't going to offer anything up color-wise, but they still will net you a great recording. So, long story short, this isn't something that should be holding you back from making a great recording. With all the color from compression, EQ, and whatever else you throw at the track during mixdown, the pre is not really going to make that big of a difference for you. It's certainly not going to take a mediocre performance to the next level, and honestly, that's the artist's job. These videos take a lot of time and research to put together. This video took me weeks to plan and shoot and record. If you've gotten anything from today's video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. It'll really help us out. If you're into studio gear, mics, pre's, and other audio-related things, hit that notified button so you'll be notified next time we put up a video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. Or if you want to stay anonymous or just hit me up privately, hit my website. There's a contact form on there. You can hit me through there. I've had a lot of people hitting me up recently over some mod things and everything else. I love hearing from you guys. Well, that's going to do it for this time. This is Pags, signing off.